Well, folks, thanks for joining us. I know you can't all read the responses in chat here, but for me, this is really exciting because everybody's tuning from different states here. We have Ipswich, Mass. We have Paradox, New York, Chatham, New Hampshire, Bristol, Connecticut, Waltham, Mass, down in Norwich, all the way over in Middlesex, 2 miles away, Hanover, New Hampshire. So yeah, thank you all for really bringing out the Derby, Vermont. So basically Canada. Yeah, so really fun to have a regional spread here. Thank you all for being here tonight. And my name is Sean. I'm with North Branch Nature Center. And I'd like to thank Tyler for spending the evening with us here. I'd also like to say a quick few words of thanks to all of our sponsors. I know their logo is not up here right now, but first and foremost, big thanks to Green Mountain Audubon Society for their partnership in making tonight possible, and for their partnership in all of our kind of bird-related programs and presentations this winter. So stay tuned for some periodic bird programs all winter long as part of our Naturalist Journey series. Also want to say a big thanks to Hunger Mountain Co-op, to Union Mutual, to Washington Electric Co-op, to Onion River Outdoors, and to Edward Jones, the office of Keith LaCroix. Without all of our sponsors, this sort of thing would not be possible. So thanks to our sponsors. This is going to be recorded tonight and available on our website after the program. And so if for whatever reason you're having any tech issues, the sound isn't working, or the computer falls off the stairs or something, you can always tune in and catch up in just a couple of days once you get the file up under our website. So northbranchnaturecenter.org/presentations for that. And also you can visit that same site, northbranchnaturecenter.org/presentations, for all of our Naturalist Journeys programs coming up for the rest of the winter. Tonight's program kicks off our whole series. This is, I think, our 26th season of presentations like this. And we have about a dozen scheduled on Wednesday nights throughout the rest of the winter. Everything from birds to photography to truffles to you name it. So so do join in for that. Let's see. If anybody has any questions, I would recommend that you throw them into the chat bar here. You can either put them in the chat or you can put them in the Q&A. And either way, I'll see them. And Tyler, we can take questions at the end, or we can take questions as we go. If you get to a good stopping point and you want to see if there's anything that I can throw at you, I'll relay some questions. Otherwise, you can hold it to the end, whatever your preference is.
Let's go for the end.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, I'll collate those, but folks definitely feel free to use that. So yeah, without further ado, I want to thank Tyler Hoar for joining us from the Finch Research Network. And Tyler has taken over the reins of the winter finch forecast, which is hallowed, especially going into the Christmas bird count season. Ours here is just in a couple days from now, and so this is a poignant time to be learning about our winter finches. And Tyler, thanks again. I'll turn it right over to you.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the winter finch forecast. There. Just 1 second. There we go. This is my second year during the winter finch forecast. It started by Ron Pittaway in 1999. He evolved over a few years till 2003 when the format pretty well set in. If anyone's met Ron Pittaway, you know his enthusiasm is very infectious. You want to look at trees and drive hundreds of miles to look at trees just to give him information. That's what happened to me. I ended up driving over quite a bit of the central and eastern boreal for work, actually stopping randomly, looking at trees. Just this summer, I took my youngest daughter on a week-long road trip just to basically look at trees. And she tolerated me looking at tens of thousands of trees. These are the tree species we sample primarily that give most of the guidance to what will happen with the finches. The primary tree species that drive a lot of this for winter finches is white spruce, black spruce, and tamarack. For the stuff like red poles, it's the birches and the alders. And in 2020, we had in Eastern North America, we had a very poor cone crop right across the board, except for one species, the Eastern white pine, which for a lot of areas, it saved people from having to see finches. This year in Eastern North America, the Eastern white pine is basically pretty much taken the year off. The cone crop is absent to very poor, but a lot of other trees in our area, in the belt, the quote unquote, the belt of food, which you and myself are both in, a lot of other species have taken up the crop and are having quite good crops. Except for one species in the boreal forest, the tamarack, which is a very big species, a food source for many of the winter finches. For a second year in a row, actually most of the boreal forest, second year in a row in the eastern boreal forest, the tamarack crop is quite poor. I don't know why. It might be they're still in 2019, they had extremely heavy crop, and they might still be recovering from that event. There's various tree species. Sorry, I don't have them. I couldn't enlarge this anymore in this little pictures. The various tree species here drive various finch species. Like pine siskins, they're the generalists, but they like their white spruce cones. White-winged crossbills are spruces, and they love the tamaracks, and vice versa. Evening grosbeaks, they'll take various seeds and cones, and they get stuff like pine grosbeaks, which are, if they're not eating tree buds, they're basically looking for berries, and primarily major source is mountain ash. The winter finch forecast, we have 52, I do believe, this year. People going out there looking at trees for us and telling us what they see. Seeing that everyone has a different level of knowledge and expertise in tree crop, we just asked them to give us a general view, in their personal view, what they think their local tree crops are. I'll send out the list of tree species and ask them to rate each crop in late summer by this: none, very poor, poor, up to excellent and bumper. It allows us to get a general picture of what is happening on this. For the winter finch forecast, we have to look at it on a very big scale, because we're trying to look across North America, and we have people of various different degrees of expertise telling us in different areas, and it helps build a general picture of what's exactly happening on the big scheme. Some years we have poor crops. This is 2019, where if you read Ron Pittaway's report, he said basically you have to go out the boreal forest to see these finches. In 2019, the cone crop throughout huge swaths of the boreal forest was bumper. Many of these trees, the branches were bending over from the amount of fresh cones on them. I was working on the James Bay coast on shorebirds, and every morning before we went out on the tidal flats to look for shorebirds, we were entertained by flock after flock of hundreds of white-winged crossbills pouring in to our area to feed on the crop. They were bringing in babies that they already had earlier in the year. They arrived, then the males started breaking off in the flocks, singing on territory, and then all the adult females disappeared because they were nesting again for a second time that year because the food source was so abundant. This year, it is a different picture. This year, I had to do a lot of weather watching this year. From Western North America, just west of Lake Superior, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, there was a widespread drought. A lot of farmers in the prairies had no crops. We had intense and widespread forest fires. In Ontario alone, northwestern Ontario alone, we had almost 1,200 forest fires. So if you had smoky skies late this summer in August, late July, and early September, it was probably from these fires. We had just over 6,000 forest fires in Canada reported this year, and they were pretty intense, pretty dramatic. And we had problems with the drought, not just the drought and the forest fires. We had record-setting temperatures in the Northwest Territories, Labrador, and we set the all-time Canadian record. This little town in Linton, called Linton, BC, in the interior of British Columbia, set the Canadian record for temperature. The next day, it broke it and set the new Canadian record at 121 degrees Fahrenheit. And unfortunately, on the third day, a forest fire destroyed the town. And also, away from a lot of these forest fires, which took over the western half of the boreal forest, we had the eastern half of the boreal forest, where the spruce budworm outbreaks continued to grow in Quebec and in Ontario, and the jack pine budworms were expanding in Western Ontario and in Manitoba. This is a map of the boreal forest stretching from coast to coast and even up almost to the Arctic Ocean. There's a large, large forest, and the vast majority of it is roadless. This is, each one of these dots represents locations of our Finch forecast reporters here. It's primarily, you can see, in Ontario, New England, Eastern Boreal Forest area. It was primarily, when Ron developed this, it was primarily Ontario focused, and as the enthusiasm increased each year, waiting for the Finch forecast, more and more reporters across North America have added on to this. And our goal is to keep expanding this to as many people as we can. We take any level of expertise so people can provide the information and try to develop the biggest picture we can across North America. Last year, there was an excellent spruce crop going through the Western Boreal Forest. And east of that spruce crop, the food sources were absolutely pathetic and contributed to our massive finch eruption in eastern North America last year. In the West, a lot of finches just stayed there because they had lots of food. This year, it's a different story. This year, the belt of food is from Newfoundland through the Maritime provinces, New England, into the Great Lakes states. To the west, the drought and the fires have seriously impacted all cone crops and the berry crops. So much so that a lot of birds that were in the west, if they didn't come to the east, they went south into the Rockies and the Cascade Mountains looking for more food. But we luckily live in the land of the belt of food. There's a lot of food out there, which is holding the finches. However, for our feeders, we may not get them at the feeders that regularly because they have a lot of food outside and away from our feeders. As they diminish that food source, they'll probably look at our feeders more as the winter progresses. Now we'll look at the species. This lovely one, the white-winged crossbill, is a very big nomadic species. They'll swing back and forth across the boreal forest in search of food. Last year, they all went to Western North America. This year, they came east. The province of Ontario population is estimated to be 5 million birds. The Canadian population is 33 million birds. The North American population is approximately 35 million birds. A lot of birds that stay up in the boreal forest that we don't even see each year. And last winter, we had white-winged crossbills. The one thing of eBird, each one of these markers could be one bird, it could be 1,000 birds. We don't have the differentiation in the size right now. But you can see a lot of birds in New England, right along the coast, and in Massachusetts, Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto, the urban areas, they were feeding on, a lot of these birds in the east here were feeding on exotic spruces that were in town that actually had cones. Out away from town, there was very few and far between. If you look to the Western Great Lakes, Lake Michigan, Lake Superior, you'll see a tight line of records along both on the west coast and northwest coast of Superior and the west coast of Lake Michigan, but not a lot of birds in actual Michigan itself. This was pointing towards the birds were coming out of the Northwest, out of that big cone crop last year. A lot of white-winged crossbills came out after a couple of events. We had a large freezing rain event in November last year in Northwestern Ontario and Manitoba. It lasted for a few days. A lot of white-winged crossbills couldn't get their cone crop into the cone crop. So Duluth, Minnesota area had a large flight shortly thereafterwards, a white-winged crossbill streaming out of that area, heading south, looking for cones they can actually get through with the ice to. You see the map here, but last summer, the white-winged crossbills were primarily coastal looking for the exotics. This year, in the summer, they're all over the place in New England and the Maritime provinces and the province of Newfoundland. What was noticed in eBird, and a lot of my reporters are telling me this, that all of a sudden in July, white-winged crossbills just came in and started moving east. They weren't there, and all of a sudden one day flocks of them were coming through. The white-winged crossbills came out of the drought areas in the west, and large numbers of them moved to the east. So much so that my reporter in the island of Newfoundland said they've been swamped with them. They're in their backyard singing, and by August they were already nesting again. This year, comparing the last year's and this year's, you can see last year's they were in the coast and in the cities. This year, they're on the right-hand side map. They were much more widespread because they have a suitable cone crop of native and exotics throughout this belt of food. They should actually start to breed here in late winter if their cone crops hold. White-winged crossbills, those who would love to see them at the feeders, even when I've been up in the northern boreal where it's quite cold and there's very little food, you still don't see them very often at feeders. They're a very tough little bird, and they just want to find their cones and their seed sources. Now, this is a local bird in New England, the Great Lakes states, the red crossbill, which doesn't seem to want to move too much into the boreal forest. There are birds in the boreal forest, but in the east, they tend to be just south in central Ontario, eastward to Newfoundland. Population is much smaller, especially estimated to be 175,000 birds in the east. Last year, we had the eastern white pine crop, was the one crop of cones that was quite good. And that concentrated the red crossbills primarily in that cone crop. And they stayed there and held themselves. And then they slightly moved out as the winter progressed, but that species held the red crossbills within the area. And you can compare this summer to currently now. The map on the left is the summer. The map on the right is as of 2 o'clock this afternoon. The red crossbills haven't moved too much. They're pretty much staying in this belt of food. They didn't leave last winter. They made it through with the white pine, and now they were rewarded with this belt of food. So they're generally just enjoying it. They're now moving through the exotic spruces, red pine plantations, but they're here. And I'm getting several reports of people seeing them on the roadsides in the Adirondacks right now. Pine siskins are our next species. These are the Swiss Army knife of finches. They eat insects, various seed sources, and they can be quite resilient. Last year, when we did the forecast, we were getting very few reports of pine siskins in the east. We were getting reports of high numbers of them in the west. So we figured a lot of them went to the west. However, what we did know, because of COVID and not a lot of people being allowed to travel to the various northern communities in eastern Canada, was that there was a large amount of pine siskins that were in the spruce budworm outbreaks that didn't move. They stayed up there and they're eating the egg masses and tiny caterpillars, and they're being quite resilient. And then when they decided to leave there, they came out in huge numbers. And as we all probably saw, them come to our feeders in the fall quickly and then disappear till late winter. People in Alabama and the Gulf states really quite enjoyed that. On myself, I did not have pine siskins till January, and they didn't peak until late April. And I actually had a pair nesting in my backyard in a white cedars because the cedars had a good crop, and then a red squirrel ate the nest. Last fall versus this fall. The map on the left is last fall. You see the darker the purple the dots are more checklists in that square. The lighter pink ones are like usually one checklist. And if it doesn't have a pink, no one reported it. Last year, the pine siskins moved in big numbers and just headed further south. This year, the map on the right, there's still dots all over, but you can see in the Quebec area through southern Ontario, to the Great Lakes and into New England, there's darker purple dots there. There's more pine siskins sitting up here and not moving south because they have a nice cone crop that they're utilizing. The 2019 map shows similar to what the pine siskins are doing currently right now. Some have gone south. The majority of them are staying up in the boreal forest and on the southern edge of the boreal forest through the belt of food like they are this year. You can see in 2020 last year, they streamed south, and the majority of them were from South Carolina west into Arizona and Texas, deep south. If you watch any feeder cams last year, you would see pine siskins all over these feeder cameras. I've seen feeder cameras in Texas where the dominant bird was pine siskins. But this year, if they get one, they'll be lucky. Now, next one is our charismatic little common hoary redpolls. But if anyone's seen the latest paper that came out, apparently common, hoary, and in the European species, lesser redpolls are all probably going to be lumped together as one species because there's apparently a super gene that gives these birds individual different traits between the three species. So, but in the meantime, we'll enjoy common and hoary redpolls. The difference between common and hoary redpolls. Common redpolls get more of a dingy red, darker stripes. Hoary redpolls, they're white frosted. They have a white rump. The males will have a very light pink hue along the edges of the breast, and their bills look like their bills have been pushed back into their head. They have a smallish bill. Hoary redpolls are the ones that breed much, much further north than the common redpolls. Common redpolls will breed just south of the tree line into the open boreal forest. Hoary redpolls, if you go to the high Arctic, that's one of the passerines you'll see way up there. Now, these two, the redpolls, are very charismatic survivalists. They have to deal with winter temperatures in the boreal forest if they don't come south at -40 Fahrenheit regularly. So what they'll do is they'll sleep in the snow. They'll just plop in and dive right into the fluffy snow and sleep in the snow overnight to avoid the cold winter temperatures, and then emerge from the snow in the next morning. If they have events where there's freezing rain, that could cause big issues with them, but they're usually that far up in the boreal forest, they don't see freezing rain. They also have a pouch in their throat where they can expand the pouch out so they can gorge seeds and fill that so full of seeds that they can retire back to a conifer out of sight, stay nice and warm, and enjoy their meal. So when you see them at feeders and they're just gorging away, that's what they're doing. They're coming in there, taking as many seeds as they can off your feeder as quickly as possible, and then go retire to digest. These little survivalists, they did a test up in Alaska, university test. They tried to freeze the redpolls. They found out that doing tests in cold chambers, they found out that common redpolls can survive down to -65 Fahrenheit, and hoary redpolls down to -88 degrees Fahrenheit. So pretty much cold as you can think, they can survive. These guys are tough little birds, and this year they're in our area. Last year in the east, we had no food. They primarily like birch and alder crops, and there was no birch or alder. So they came down in huge numbers. You can see in the map on the left, that really dark purple is northern New England, the St. Lawrence Valley. They were very thick in there. Why? Because they hit weedy fields. In the winter, they will happily go into weedy fields that have lots of little seeds and grass seeds. And if they can get to it, they will sit there by the hundreds, if not thousands, in really good fields and clean every little seed out they can before they go to the next field. This is the current common redpoll distribution. We had an event. If anyone watches Tadoussac, you've seen them up in the far right here, if you can. There's an arrow, a yellow arrow that points towards Tadoussac. And that's where they had 250,000 redpolls go through there in October and November, migration. And the birds were all heading southwest up the St. Lawrence River. And at the same time, oh, excuse me, back a second. Second here, we just have a, there we go. Apologize for that. In the west, you can see along Lake Michigan, the west shore of Lake Michigan, the northwest shore of Lake Superior, that what I said about the white-winged crossbills, that really tight line of lots of records. I was pointing again that these birds were coming in from the northwest where there was drought and no food, moving towards the southeast looking for food. And if they hit the top end of Lake Superior, they just kept going east. If they hit south of Thunder Bay in the north corner of Lake Superior, they went south and around the lake. We figure possibly why Tadoussac, Quebec had 250,000 common redpolls heading southwest is the eastern population were moving south, and birds coming from the western Canada were heading straight east across the boreal forest until they hit the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and they turned south to join the eastern birds. in the migration. Now they've moved into the St. Lawrence River, New England, Central Ontario, and this belt of food where there's a very good alder crop and quite a good white birch crop. And they will be dining on those 2 tree seeds heavily until they clean them up. And then at the same time, actually, they will hit weedy fields when they can, but the prefer is these 2 tree crops. So in Vermont area, northern New England, I would look at your neighborhood, find every birch tree you know that looks like it has a very good seed crop, and just watch it as the winter progresses. I've had one group of 4 red crossbills in my neighborhood, didn't look at my feeders, went straight to the abundant birch trees that are in my neighborhood, dined for a few days, then disappeared. They will, as the winter progresses, finch lovers in New England, northern New York State, should watch the eBird maps for primarily Quebec, the Quebec City, Montreal area. Watch as those birds should progress down slowly into New England. Hoary redpolls might be the last winter we can call them hoary redpolls before they become redpolls. The map on the left is all the eBird records for 5 years. Not a lot of birds, are widespread, but for 5 years, not a lot of sightings. The one on the right is just the sightings from last year's eruption of common redpolls and hoary redpolls. They came down from the Arctic, they hit the boreal forest, and there were no sources of food. So what do, they poured down with the common redpolls, found these weedy fields and bird feeders, and just settled in big numbers. We may not see hoary redpoll numbers do this again for several years. Our next one is purple finch, a regular breeder in the Great Lakes states, New England, the Maritime provinces. It is one of the species that will move south further than most other winter finches. Purple finches and pine siskins will happily move to the southern Gulf states on eruption years, much further south than most birds. The male and the female look distinctly different. Male purple finches get reported by a lot of people in cities when they're actually house finches. Female purple finches, they look quite distinct compared to a house finch, so people usually don't mistake them. Some winters where you know the purple finches have moved south and people are reporting them in cities, you got to be careful because they may be a really bright male house finch, but years like this, both species can be regularly at your feeders. Here's the population increasing. This is in southern Ontario. The map on the left is earlier in the decade, and there's a few records in Pennsylvania. The map on the east, you can see on the right, they've expanded their population. They're breeding in most forests. They're breeding all throughout Pennsylvania and New York State and New England. They're on the increase. This is one of the species that benefit from the spruce budworms, which I'll talk about near the end of the talk. They'll change up to 80% of their diet will be on this. So in these budworm outbreaks, there's high densities of purple finches. So they're being very successful raising lots of young. So these young birds have to find new territories to nest. So they seem to be expanding and utilizing other areas. Last year, with this big eruption in the east, you can see the dark purples all the way down the Gulf states and Florida, up to Tennessee, Missouri. If you wondered where your purple finches were last winter, you can see New England Maritime provinces, they were just left us. I watched in my house, I watched several come through in early fall and then didn't see them again till May. This year, summer 2020, the map on the right, that is what our early winter is looking like too. Most of the purple finches are right along the border areas down into Maryland. The map on the left is last winter's reports of the purple finches. You can see the hot New England, Vermont area, Southern Ontario. It's a lot of pink. The darker purples are much further south. This year, New England, down in the mountains of New Jersey, into Virginia, is holding a lot more purple finches than they had last year. These birds have a food source. they don't want to travel that far this year. So we will see them at their feeders. This lovely pine grosbeak. This is one of the toughest birds for surviving winter. If they can't find a cone seed source, they just go over to the tamarack or spruce and start eating tree buds. They are the one species of all the winter finches, including the hoary redpoll, which nests above the boreal forest, that do not want to leave the boreal forest. They're very tough birds, gorgeous, large finches, beautiful musical song. If anyone has watched the feeder camera at Cornell from Northern Ontario, Manitouwadge, Northern Ontario, they have 15 to 20 pine grosbeaks that are coming to their feeder regularly throughout the day. You can hear them in the background. They're not in the feeder camera. You can hear them singing in the background. Last year's eruption, there was no food up in Labrador and eastern Quebec, and they had a huge number of birds come through Tadoussac. And they came southwest along the north shore of the St. Lawrence. And soon as the St. Lawrence River got narrow enough, like most of these finches do not want to go across water. So once the St. Lawrence River got narrow enough near Quebec City, the birds spilled across and went straight south into New England. New England had a very good flight of pine grosbeaks last year compared to most other areas. But these birds wanted to go south looking for food, and as soon as they came and that river got narrow enough, they just decided, forget going southwest, we're heading straight south. And they went into the ornamental crab apples and mountain ashes. You might have even seen them in parking lots, city streets, city parks, your front yard, backyard. They were just enjoying these berries, and a lot of times they're completely oblivious to people, because a lot of these pine grosbeaks have been born and raised in the boreal forest, nowhere near any human or any road, and to them you're just a caribou or something. So sometimes if I'll walk by a flock and now you know they're there, I'll also look over and they're just not paying much attention to me until they notice I'm making eye contact with them, and then the predator prey interaction, when they get a little nervous, it happens quickly. This year on the right, we've had a movement out of Labrador into St. Lawrence again, but they're all settled in the St. Lawrence, Central Ontario, the Quebec, Vermont, Maine border up to Michigan, that because the boreal forest this year is having a bumper crop of mountain ash berries. So a lot of these birds last year, with what mountain ash berries we had last year, before the pine grosbeaks even got to them, the black bears ate them, the robins and swings and thrushes cleaned them up for their migration. So by the time the purple finches, let me see, the pine grosbeaks arrived further south, they didn't have much food source. This year, they got a huge food source, and they're going to try to exploit it as long as they can. This is another species, mid-January, I would probably look for a little more in New England and Adirondacks. As they clean up more of their mountain ash to the north, they'll start drifting further south. Find your favorite mountain ash, ornamental crab apples. Just keep an eye on it. If you drive by and all of a sudden you see crab apple that have been partially consumed just lying on the snow, it's a good sign that there's probably a flock of pine grosbeaks somewhere in the neighborhood looking. Now, I will have a bias here. This is my favorite finch. I grew up here in Southern Ontario where this species would show up in my parents' backyard every winter, eating sunflower seeds and crab apple berries in the backyard, and then they disappeared, and I didn't see one for 20 years. I admit my age. I was a child of the 70s, so I was growing up during the major spruce budworm outbreaks, which was also the major time of evening grosbeaks. They both have a boom bust cycle, which I'll explain in a few minutes, and they're very closely related, interlinked. Evening grosbeaks were on the rise. In Canada, they have been put as special concern and threatened in some jurisdictions because they were on a big decline from the 70s. As the budworms collapsed, they collapsed. However, now the budworms are having their best outbreak in the last 40 years now. So this species is benefiting from it, and now they're reproducing quickly, and you're seeing more showing up. And last year we had a dramatic movement of them. This is as 2 o'clock today. This is all the eBird reporting for the fall in eastern northeast North America. There's birds scattered throughout New England, the Maritimes, southern central Ontario. A big cluster you see along the St. Lawrence River in Quebec. Those birds are near the big spruce budworm outbreaks, and they're just moving around. They're slowly moving around looking for feeders. Some of these birds will move solitary as the winter goes on. Last year, we had this huge eruption, which is on the right. You see these records of evening grosbeaks going all the way down in Georgia, North Carolina. We had evening grosbeaks even reported from Orlando. On the map on the left is eBird record for the previous 10 years. The odd record going down south of Pennsylvania, away from the mountains in Virginia, but very few. Last year's eruption, they did stuff they haven't seen in 40 years. This last fall, each one of these spots, or the diamonds, are where there's more than 100 evening grosbeaks a day recorded. The stars are where there's more than 400 evening grosbeaks reported. Looking at the literature, after we had this big event, it's been 40 years since they did this. These birds came through in 2 days, basically, in big flocks, and they just didn't stop. There's feeders here. There was some food for them. They didn't care. They just moved. These are some of the locations here. My house in suburbia, I had 105 come by in one day. None stopped. I had a great feeder. None stopped. Of all the 300 evening grosbeaks I saw last year fly over my house, one stopped for one day. Made me very happy. Hot Cliff is on the north shore of Lake Erie, just across from Cleveland. They had 905. The next day, the Bluffs, which is on the east side of Lake Huron, over 500. Downtown Toronto, less than 2 miles away from the CN Tower, right in downtown Toronto, this park had over 400 come by, all heading southwest. The 24th, 25th was a big flight. We thought it was amazing. And then October 30th happened. These birds streamed along North Shore Lake Ontario and North Shore Lake Erie, these 3 sites here. This site here, just northwest of Cleveland, on the North Shore Lake Erie. Let's go back and show you this. That site right there had 1,347 counted, all streaming southwest, avoiding whatever food that was there locally and just moving high numbers. We had not seen that. Looking in the literature, had to go back to 1969 and 1972 since we've had days in Ontario reported of that many evening grosbeaks pouring through. Those years when the spruce budworms were starting to expand and start to peak in some areas, the species is totally benefiting from it. They had food, but these finches some years, just do weird things and fly over food. Like this year, the common redpolls that went east into Quebec, they flew over a lot of food in Ontario, but they just wanted to go for a fly. The evening grosbeaks did the same thing and went far south. This is all the eruption records. We had them all through New England, nice purple there, but we had reports all the way down further south. David Yeaney, he's from Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. They've been doing a study on wintering migrations of evening grosbeaks. They have found when they've tagged these birds and put geolocators on them that they think they just have one flock of birds coming to their feeders. It seems that they have multiple flocks using various areas. So if you think you have one flock of evening grosbeaks coming to your feeder all the time, keep an eye on the numbers and the sex makeup between the males and the females, because probably a lot of these flocks that are in New England for the winter are different flocks. You could have one town could have 3 or 4 flocks moving around. So what they found is a lot of these birds that they tagged are coming up from Quebec, flying through New England and going into Western Pennsylvania for the winter during these big flight years. And when they go back, they tend to follow the same route straight back for a lot of these birds. This is the reason why evening grosbeaks, purple finches, and pine siskins are expanding in eastern North America. This little insect is hated by the forestry sector in Canada. It devours vast areas of balsam firs, white spruce crops, a lot of valuable lumber crops. It takes a few years for them to kill a tree, but they will, and they just keep expanding. And these, we all know, there's the words of the spruce budworm warblers, the Cape May, the bay-breasted, and the Tennessee warbler. They all expand, and the populations increase quite heavily when it's a good spruce budworm outbreak. Here in Ontario, all three of those warbler species, we see a lot more than when we did 5 years ago. They're having great years. These three finch species have utilized the spruce budworm heavily. Evening grosbeak and purple finch, up to 80% of their diet during breeding season will be spruce budworm caterpillars. So they fly in these areas where the big outbreaks are. They can feed and have great reproduction success there because they don't have to do a lot of work to feed a lot of kids because there's just so many caterpillars. This is what light spruce budworm outbreak damage looks like. They eat the tips of this balsam fir, eat a little more. This is actually light. These trees this year, this was last year, 2020 in Northeastern Ontario. I checked them out this year, they were dying because they were consumed heavily. You drive by, you see this brown tinge in these areas of all the needles being eaten. Spruce budworm outbreaks during these huge numbers of evening grosbeaks when we had them in the 70s and 80s, we had massive spruce budworm outbreaks. 49 million acres in 1980 in Ontario. Quebec, 79 million acres. That's pretty much the size of Maine, basically almost the size of New England. Eastern Canada in 1975, between Newfoundland and Manitoba, we had 129 million acres where there was significant damage by spruce budworms on spruce trees and balsam firs. So purple finches, pine siskins, evening grosbeaks, back in the 70s, why you saw them all over your feeders and that, they were having great success breeding with these large numbers of budworms. Currently, we now have 4 large outbreaks in Eastern North America happening. The 1 and 2 in Gaspé, Quebec, and number 1 on the North Shore are very large. They've been ongoing for quite a long time, and they're probably a source of the vast majority of New England's evening grosbeaks in the winter. These, in between these areas, they're smaller ones, and they're still increasing. They've been tracking, they really blew up in the last 20 years. You can see 2001, 2002, they were very low, just 2,000, 4,000 hectares. Now 8 million. Now they're 13.5 million hectares, which is basically the size of, doing the measurements today, it's the size of Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine combined. And that is in 2020, and these outbreaks are still getting bigger. So these evening grosbeaks, purple finches, and pine siskin numbers are still increasing. If they don't have food, they have to go somewhere. This year they have food in our region, so they should settle in. We figure this budworm outbreak, they're treating it with this bacteria spore called bacillus. They spray it out there when the caterpillars are eating. The caterpillars ingest it, and then the bacteria alter the gut of the caterpillars to basically starve them. Unfortunately, it's not just selective for one species of caterpillar. Any caterpillar that does eat that will die. But primarily they're spraying it. It's very expensive, so they're trying to spray it in areas where there's valuable timber resources where they can actually try to save the trees. Areas where the budworms are really exploded, they can't afford to spray that area. So the budworms will still keep on marching until nature stops. There's a parasitic wasps that they're finding now in areas of high density. Mother Nature helps take care of the budworms, not just using birds eating it. There's parasitic wasps that go after the budworms in areas of high densities. So that's one of the ways Mother Nature helps to control it. Now, the future forecast. I would love to expand this for more and more reporters. I hope to get some of the people here today will send me an email and tell me what they see next August in their area. And even in the exotic, if you don't have some of these native trees, if you have exotic birches and exotic spruces, it's great to know if they're having a cone crop, because a lot of birds will go there. I would like to increase the diversity report of backgrounds. More First Nations communities in Northern Canada, Alaska, they out there in the land, there are a lot of areas where very few people go. They can provide great information. More forestry people who are out there working. A lot of researchers and bird atlasers who are now going across parts of Canada away from the roads, doing the bird atlasing and researching. But the last 2 years, a lot of government researchers have not been allowed to go up north because of COVID. So there have been restrictions. And at the Finch Research Network, we're in the beginning stage of developing a document and app where people can just put in the area, what tree species they have, and do the cone rating. That's just in the very beginning of that. These are all the people I want to thank this year. These are the people who made the Finch forecast for this year possible. If they don't collect the information, let me know. I can't try to stir it up in my pot to figure out what the recipe is. These are the people I am greatly appreciate. This is the Finch Research Network. It started last year. We are a nonprofit organization. We started last year. We funded some evening grosbeak now tags for the David Heaney project. And we've done some Red Crossville work. We try to collect funds so we can fund some students on various projects going forward, including Rosie Finches. The shirt I'm wearing is our Winter Finch Forecast shirt that we sell on the site to help raise money for these programs. Feeder cameras, I mentioned them earlier. COVID has been a friend for watching feeder cameras, because a lot of feeder cameras exploded because people can't go out, so they just watch what's at the bird feeders. These are two shots from this afternoon in Ontario. The one on the right is a Gonko Park in Ontario, where they have a nice evening grosbeak flock that decided to show up and stay there probably for the winter. And then one on the left is the Cornell one in Manitowoc, Northern Ontario. There's a nice pine grosbeak there, one on the ground. This feeder is now has evening grosbeaks, some red poles, but mostly pine grosbeaks. Feeder cameras, I'll admit I spent a fair amount of time on them, but I've actually been able to watch feeder cameras around the world, and you can actually see some movement. In Europe, they have a species of finch called the brambling. They had a huge flight of bramblings out of Siberia and Scandinavia into Western Europe this year. You could see it on the feeder cameras as they went through Norway. One day, there's no bramblings. Next 4 or 5 days, lots of bramblings, and then they're gone. A day or two later, the cameras in England and Western Europe, there are bramblings at the feeders for the winter. So if you want enjoyment over coffee, feeder cameras can be quite enjoyable, and see them around the world watching what finches are up to. This is a bird I saw last January in Japan. It's the Pallas's rose finch. I made a joke last year's talk going, who knows, maybe you'll see this bird. Little did I know that this bird showed up. This is the Hoar finch. It is the Eurasian equivalent of an evening grosbeak. This is the first Canadian record of this species, and one of the few in North America. It showed up in the Yukon, right near the Alaska border in Northwest Canada, in the end of December, down on Chris's bird count, I do believe, stayed till April. I was just joking around with the rose finch. This year, I didn't want to joke around with anyone else, because who knows what showed up. But this year, we have this, and it's right near your door. This is a brambling photographed north of Manitoba, north of Montreal. It was there for a couple of days, and then the one was photographed in Western Montreal, just north of the border. Looking at the pictures, they seem to be probably different birds. This year, that huge flight of bramblings you're watching coming out of Scandinavia produced flocks of 30 to 50 plus showing up in Iceland. Those birds in Iceland are scattered across Iceland or have gone on other ways. Probably this big flight out of Scandinavia is producing several bramblings from Eastern North America. These two and probably more. I would not be surprised if Chris's bird counts in New England, Maritime provinces, and other ones in Eastern North America, Northeastern North America, that more bramblings get found. I think there's a few more than just two out there right now. They're about the size of a junco. Apparently both these brambling records, the birds are hanging out with juncos coming to feeders. And I'd like to thank you now. And these nice little Christmas ornament redpolls, I'd like to thank you for having us. And I hope you enjoy the finches. They are in our area this year. Other parts of North America are jealous that we do have them here. We may not have them at our feeders. We may have to go out to look for them a bit, but they are in the woods.
Tyler, thanks so much. Oh, I'm really excited to go find a brambling now. I'll be putting the word out around here for bramblings for our Christmas bird count in a couple days. We have lots of questions. Can I start firing away?
Okay.
All right. So wondering what actually causes the outbreak of those budworms? Is it temperature? Is it climate?
It's a natural cycle. It's been going on for millennia. It's about a 40-year cycle where they come up, devour their balsam firs, which they primarily target. They lose their food source. They start plummeting again. And the evening grosbeaks, they say the evening grosbeaks in the east were very rare in the 1800s. And the tree box elder, people started in the prairies planting box elders. And one theory is that the evening grosbeaks came from Western North America following these areas of box elder because they enjoyed eating those seeds, that they came themselves east, and then they realized, oh, it's a good food source, and the population exploded with the budworms.
And so how many years do you think it'll be before that the current outbreak that we're in the midst of will start to decline and we'll be back to none?
I think it will. I think it might start decreasing in the next 5 years, or they could just move. These moths are migratory; they'll blow with the wind. Some areas, like the province of New Brunswick, it's a very industrial forestry province, and they're next door to Quebec, so they're spraying heavily on the border trying to stop that. But I think evening grosbeaks have another 5 to 10 years of a good food source before there's a decline again.
And so when the evening grosbeaks are so closely tied to the budworms, why is it then that they are flying so far south down into Pennsylvania and farther south in these big eruptions, when it seems like that's taking them pretty far away from the budworms, and presumably there's still budworms to be eating up in the boreal forest even throughout the winter?
No, the budworms, what they do, they pupate and become moths in July, lay their eggs, and their eggs hatch again in late August, early September, and they're tiny little caterpillars. And the pine siscins love them. And then as fall progresses, they cocoon up in the base of the needles. The pine siscins can get to them, but the evening grosbeaks can't. What the evening grosbeaks will do, and the pearl finches, they'll switch to various maple keys, ash keys. They'll eat cherries, choke cherries, and berries. And they'll hold themselves that way over the winter. Like winter holly, they love winter holly. Last year, they had no secondary food source. So when they were down the budworms and whatever little food they had, they went, oh, we're in trouble. And they went. And when you have these big eruptions, you do get a higher mortality because they have a long way to come back.
Oh, fascinating. All right, changing gears a little bit. I'm wondering about just eBird, using eBird in general. Sam was wondering, good way to put this, how you tease apart, actual movements and trends over time of the actual bird populations versus just the increasing popularity of eBird, and how that tracks upon just dense human populations, and how you suss that out.
eBird, with the human population, so you can see in the boreal forest, Ontario and Quebec, the vast majority of our roads are in the southern half of the province, southern quarter of the province. There's a lot of birds further north we don't have the information from. eBird, yes. The urban areas, there is a bias towards the urban areas. What I try to do when I use eBird, I can't use it a very tiny specific. I have to go to a very big picture to try to watch the movement. And seeing that you can't differentiate readily between one individual and 100 individuals in that checklist bubble until you click each one. There is a bias. The urban areas do provide a bias, but you have to look at it in a very big picture. And what I do, I admit I do this a lot, maybe too much for my wife. I sit there and I watch eBird maps, and I try to watch them week by week to try to find the trend. and I look at the eBird maps and I look at the weather. I look at almost every day, I look at 46 weather stations across Canada, starting in midsummer. And I just try to figure out what's going on there. And I'll look at eBird trying to figure out what's happening. But when you see Lake Superior, Lake Michigan ones, you see those tight lines of the red poles and the crossbills. You can look at that backwards and figure out where they came from. If they come on one side of the lake, they're coming from that direction. When like last year, the crossbills in the east, they just came straight south looking for food. But the ones from the west, they came, you can see the angle on the big picture, but the small picture, no, it's pretty hard.
This is a crazy question, but I'm wondering, you know, when we're tracking warbler migration in the spring, you know, you can use radar to see these massive nocturnal movements. I'm wondering that, you know, at the scale of some of these movements with the winter finches, is there any, you know, mass nocturnal movement that can be picked up by radar, or is this really just kind of diurnal leapfrogging through the trees kind of thing?
The vast majority of winter finches are diurnal flyers, and they fly a lot lower than the finches. I mean, a lot lower than the warblers. I have a hawk watch in my house, and that's why I can see so many evening grosbeaks, because they're only 200 feet up in the air or less. Just being noisy as can be, you can hear them coming, and then bang, they're gone. Yeah, most of the finches stay much lower to the ground because they're diurnal. If they're up high up, merlins, sharpshin hawks, peregrines can get them very quickly, and gulls. That's why they try to avoid water, because they fly during the day, and open water, herring gulls and ring-billed gulls come after them pretty quickly.
Sure. There's a couple of questions about the where people can go to find these feeder cams, and I'll offer, when we put this recording up on our website, often below the talks, that we'll put in other, you know, interesting links and things like that that are related. So I'll put in the Finch Research Network website there. I'll also put in some of the feeder cams that you're referring to. But are there particular ones that you recommend folks check out?
I have some biased ones. I have a couple in Japan I watch every single day, because in Japan, just before dinner time is their morning. So I can watch hawfinches, Japanese grosbeaks, bramblings showing up at their feeders just before I have my dinner. But there's really good ones in France and Hungary that are really good for Eurasian finches. Here in North America, the Algonquin Park one's quite good. The Manitowoc one's quite good. But we seem to be, our winter finch cameras seem to be a lot more hit miss than the ones I see in Europe. I think might be more forest, more food for the birds here.
Sure.
I will send you all the links of all the cameras, because you can see all kinds of neat stuff in these cameras.
That'd be terrific. Yeah, thank you. Ellie is reporting hearing red crossbills singing over in the Adirondacks in the last few days, and wondering if that means they might be breeding here soon. And then kind of my larger question is, could you talk just a minute about just the breeding pattern, the breeding seasonality of crossbills, and how that ties into perhaps the cone crops?
Crossbills will go any time of the year if the food source is right. Early winter is not their favorite time. Watching January, February, they're singing now. There's a lot of them are just getting warmed up for territories. As January and February progress, they will be on nests. And watch the white-winged crossbills that are around now. If you're in an area, you see white-winged crossbills, and if they're not singing yet, if they're still around there in a month, you'll probably hear them singing, setting up. Because they'll go, white-winged crossbills will nest sometimes 3 times in a year if the food source is right. Like where I was up in James Bay in 2019, when they were coming in by the hundreds per hour, half the birds that are coming in were juveniles that just fledged within weeks beforehand. Mom and dads are just bringing them into a new area, letting go of the kids and saying, forget you, we're going to raise more kids because here's the food. So yeah, they're getting really, really cold. Don't be surprised if they're on nest, because they evolved in the boreal forest where they're used to cold to nest. Sure. It's all about the food.
That's impressive, thinking about a bird that's just a few grams not just surviving, but actually thriving to the point that it's, raising young in these temperatures. That's wild. Sam is wondering, does the Finch network do anything currently with winter rosy finch dispersal? And saw on the Finch Facebook page that there's a rosy finch feeder watcher project going on now. Do you have anything to do with that?
I do not have anything to do with the rosy finches. I'm on the evening grosbeak working group. Yes, we're just starting. Finch Network is starting with some partners in the West for rosy finches, because that's 3 species that are going to be in big trouble with global warming and droughts and that. So they're just starting to partner with that and figuring out what projects can be set up. It's just in its infancy. We'll probably have a lot more information on the website in the next month or two.
Got just a couple more questions here. I know it's 7 o'clock, but Tyler, do you have another minute or two for?
Oh, I have plenty of minutes.
Oh, super. Thank you. Let's see. Richard's wondering. I know Richard is really interested in subspecies, and I was wondering if you can tease apart any of the movements of pine grosbeak subspecies throughout the Northeast.
They're pretty much the one that we expect in the Northeast. When you get more to the west, that's where it gets trickier. Is pretty much the dominant one that's here, and it gets tough if they decide to move from the west. But they're pretty much who you expect here in the east.
And is there any link between the spruce budworms and redback vole populations and anything like that? We do some saw-whet owl research down here, and of course great grays and northern hawk owls and boreal owls all depend on redback voles. Just wondering what the connection is there, and if you think about that at all.
The spruce budworms have very little effect on that, though. It's the cone crop. Like when I worked in James Bay, one year, 2018, we had no food source. So the voles and the squirrels were giving us problems at camp. 2019, food everywhere. We saw voles everywhere and squirrels everywhere, but they want nothing to do with us because they had tons of food. If the budworms get too intense in some area, they are just basically going to wipe that food source out. In some areas in Quebec and the Gaspé Peninsula, they're having forests that are just brown. They're just dead right now. And usually it's about 30 years. When balsam forest gets about 30 years old, that's when the budworms seem to really have an effect. Take a notice to it.
Well, I think we'll wrap things up here. I wanted to say another quick thanks to our sponsors. Thanks again to Green Mountain Audubon Society for making this happen this evening. Thanks to Hunger Mountain Co-op. By the way, if you want to, Hunger Mountain Co-op is always our go-to spot for pine and grosbeaks on our Christmas bird count. So pick up your groceries and your grosbeaks. Onion River Outdoors, Union Mutual, Washington Electric Co-op, and Edward Jones' office of Keith LaCroix. So thanks to all of our sponsors for making Naturalist Journeys possible. Check us out. Come back and join us again virtually in January when we resume our series. Tyler, I look forward to connecting with you about some of the links to the feeders and whatnot. And yeah, thanks so much for joining us here in Montpelier. And we really appreciate your wisdom and knowledge this evening. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. And you guys are pretty much in the center of winter finches for the winter this year.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Right.